Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to get the webinar started. Welcome to Nature Connects, the Nature Conservancy's Massachusetts webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, influencers, and our partners from across the Northeast and around the world. I'm Andy Finton, Senior Conservation Ecologist for the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts, and it's truly my pleasure to host today's webinar with Monica and Bob Leverett. I've been working to conserve the region's forests for my entire 26-year career at the Nature Conservancy. At TNC, we conserve forested landscapes across Massachusetts, across New England, and around the world. We work to reduce the loss of forests, we protect forest lands in perpetuity, and we support a balance of both actively managed and wild forests. I've only met Monica recently. I've known Bob Leverett for over 20 years. Bob is the chair of a committee we both serve on together, the state's Forest Reserve Science Advisory Committee. And that leads me to introduce our guest today. So we're really excited to be joined by Bob and Monica Leverett for a tour through the notable old growth forests of the Northeast and to celebrate their contributions to our understanding of these truly special places. Here's a little more about our guests. Bob Leverett has been described as the East's leading old growth forest evangelist. I call him a old growth forest guru, and has co-discovered most of the known old growth in Massachusetts. A co-founder of the Native Tree Society and co-author of the Sierra Club Guide to Ancient Forests of the Northeast, Bob has been the central figure in the Eastern Old Growth Forest Conference series. Educated as an engineer, Bob is the recognized expert in the discipline of measuring trees, and currently he's working with climate scientists to help measure carbon sequestration in individual trees, and is devising carbon analysis tools for conservation organizations and the general public. Monica Leverett is a classical music pianist and retired professor of music at Smith College. In addition, as Bob's partner and wife, she has spent the last 19 years exploring forests with him. They have some great stories, editing his writings and co-presenting talks. And Tina's going to put the link to Monica's website in the chat for you. As you think of questions for Bob and Monica, please enter them in the Q&A button, Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Bob and Monica, we're so pleased and so grateful for you to join us today, and I'll pass it over to you to get us started.
Here we are. Okay. Well, I better start. We better start the slide presentation.
Well, let's say hello first. I'm Monica. This is Bob. And behind us is a picture of a wonderful, large cherry tree, co-champion cherry tree of the state of Massachusetts that Bob dedicated to me when he was courting me. And it's one of the reasons why I married him. Now for our show.
Okay, everybody, welcome to Monica's and my celebration of old growth forests and a discussion of the climate contribution that they make. I'm not going to go through the items on the screen, but I wanted to, again, after welcome you, you can see two striking images, and I wanted to turn it over to Monica to let her tell you about what those pictures are. Monica.
Okay. These are two pictures of us in forests that have old growth, not in old growth in these pictures, however. We're in William Cullen Bryant Woods, the rivulet forest here, and here we're at Mohawk Trail State Forest, our forest mecca, as Bob calls it. The photographer who took the big cherry tree picture is Mitch Epstein. He's a friend of ours, and for the last 4 years, he's been working on an old growth project with the help of Bob. He will have 2 shows in the fall in New York and tour in Italy, and his website is in the chat.
Okay, now
ask the question.
The question, sorry folks, what is old growth?
And the answer is not this.
And we say that because a lot of people think of individual trees as old growth. So they will say something like, this is an old growth tree. Well, that's understandable why they would say that. But old growth is not about the individual trees. It is about the community. It is about the forest. So old growth really pertains to the forest community. This is a very old tree and possibly the largest one in all of New England. It's the great Gifford Pinchot sycamore of Simsbury, Connecticut. And there's a lot that could be said about it, but this is about forest, so we're going to move on. So here is an old growth forest. Well, we're in the canopy. And the canopy you see there is of a white oak. You can see the shingling on the branches. And we start that because that is an iconic old growth forest, about 2,500 acres of it or so. And most people will relate to it by their walks on the ground. But again, it's a community. It stretches from the upper part of the canopy to the underground component. Monica, do you have anything to add to that?
One of the wonderful things about an old growth canopy is that the trees are not well behaved. They've been through a lot. This tree has lost limbs, regrown in other directions, found different directions to find sunlight, etc. And that is also an old growth canopy characteristic.
Okay, with that then, let's move on to what Monica and I call our forest mecca, which is Mohawk Trail State Forest in Massachusetts. It has the largest single acreage of old growth forest on a property in the state. Between Mohawk and adjoining Savoy Mountain State Forest, there's pretty close to 600 acres of old growth, which is about 45% of all of that in the state. And one of the interesting things about this old growth forest is that it is historic. It's the pathway of the original Mohawk Trail goes through very close to where I have this picture. But here we're on a boulder field. And so the characteristics that you start to see that make this an old growth forest include trees of several species. And it's not just one, and they're not just one age. This is a sugar maple, somewhere between 2 and probably 250 years old, maybe even a little older. Over here is a younger, but not really young, black birch, maybe 120, 130, 140 years old. Over here is a yellow birch, considerably older, maybe 250, and again, maybe even older. Then you have a lot of younger trees in between, and over here you have beech leaves. You have a very complex forest floor. You have moss. All of these places you see here are niches in which biodiversity flourishes. I'll turn this over momentarily to Monica, but I just want to point out that within Mohawk Trail State Forest, courtesy of my good friend Tony D'Amato at the University of Vermont, he's the director of forestry program there. Trees have been dated in Mohawk to over 500 years old. They're the hemlocks. But Tony dated the 7th oldest black birch that we know of anywhere. That was about 332 years old in 2005 at core height, which means it's been a little bit older than that. And now it's over 350 years old. That's black birch, folks. Monica, do you have anything
No,
to add?
let's go on.
Let's move on. Moving on. More of Mohawk. And here's where we wanted to point to features that make an old growth forest an old growth forest. You can see down here a log that's in the process of decaying with plenty of moss on top of it. You see the ferns. Over here you see a young root of a yellow birch. You can see the beautiful young bark, early bark, and yet it's against a decaying log or standing snag. And over here is younger yellow birch bark. My good friend Lee Freilich likes to think in terms of old growth forests as multi-age forests, as opposed to just focusing on the older trees. Monica, did you have anything?
I think we're fine, and we can go on to
now
why
Why is old growth important? This is a question that we get now. I got it back in the early 1990s when I was just a pup and didn't really know. But the one answer that is always there, is prominent, is the biological diversity that is in an old growth forest, both above and below ground. Monica.
And I'd just like to comment, I used to think biodiversity was just a whole lot of different animals. It's, of course, birds, it's insects, and it's mold and fungi and slime molds and all kinds of things. And all of that diversity is so important because it helps with resiliency. And you can go on with that.
Very good point, Monica, because there's a fear that old growth forests are going to just suddenly collapse and die. That was really a belief years ago, but they continue on. You can see them in the Adirondacks, you can see them in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. They continue on because there's this resiliency, and it's through the complexity of the forest. They really hold the genetic pool developed over thousands of years. And over thousands of years, the forest had to endure everything. So they've been shaped to be resilient. And I might add that they represent the greatest amounts of stored carbon in a forest, both above and below ground, that we have. And that's very directly linked to climate mitigation. Monica, would you like to add to that, the spiritual, the aesthetic?
Well, our forest links to the past. Forests have been witnesses to the Indians and colonial settlers who went through in Mohawk, the Mohicans of Ice Glen. They're wonderful presences. And another way they're links to the past is when people core very old trees, they can follow the climate of the past and even account for historical events, such as why the Jamestown colony collapsed. There was a great drought written in the trees. Aesthetic and spiritual, well, you'll see all kinds. Old growth forests are very different. In the East, they're not just big trees like many of them in the Northwest. And you will see pictures to show in this talk, to show the great variety of aesthetics and spiritual inspiration.
Okay.
Onward.
Now, one of those places that's inspirational, at least very inspirational to most of us, is Cook Forest State Park in western Pennsylvania. In these two shots, on the left, you see Dale Luthinger, my friend there. He is the environmental interpreter for Cook Forest State Park. And in the right, you can see my tree measuring and companion
research
associate, Jared Lockwood. Jared is looking up at a 300 to 400-year-old hemlock, and Dale is looking up definitely a 350 to 400-year-old white pine, which we call the cornstalk pine. These are big trees. In fact, that white pine there was the largest single white pine in Cook Forest State Park. But notice in the foreground, you see all the mosses. You see the duff layer, although that's not quite so apparent. There's a huge amount of material that is sifted down from the canopy and forest trees that die and fall over and whatnot. So this is a forest environment. Yet, of course, the big trees they're what capture attention. Monica?
Oh, I think we've said what we need, and we can proceed to an old growth forest that's a total contrast with this one.
Oh, now who would ever call that an old growth forest? Well, it's a family collection of old red pines on basalt cliffs on Mount Tom. And my friend David Orwig, Dr. David Orwig of Harvard Forest, dated those trees to over 200 years in age, and nobody was interested in them. And so that you have a cliffside community, which we can call old growth, but certainly it doesn't look like the preceding one. And the idea here is that old growth isn't just a community that looks one way. It is tremendously, there is tremendous variation in it.
Okay, we can move on to one of my absolute favorite old growth forests. It's in Monroe State Forest, hemlock spruce. And it's just a magical place. It has less tree plant diversity than some other forests. It has an incredible duff layer. It's like a sponge. It's just absolutely amazing. And it's magical. I always think I'm going to see a fairy or a leprechaun when I go to that place. And there, now this hemlock is not in this forest.
No,
Is that correct?
That's correct. So if you look at those trees and you say, well, they don't look like 400-year-old hemlocks. Well, they aren't. Those in that picture, the one in the foreground is probably maybe 200, 180, something like that. Something happened around 200 years ago, and there's a lot of evidence that there was a major disturbance. So what we may mainly see today in this particular area is probably on the order of 200 years old. What preceded it was the old growth forest of that time. Let's move on. Now, jumping from back to Pennsylvania, and in this case to an iconic old growth forest that has been known and studied. It's in the literature. It's virtually every school of forestry identifies this as a place to go and see old growth. It's Heart's Content in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. And I won't say much about this other than at one time before this picture, the Forest Service had estimated that the amount of board footage in this forest was between 150,000, 200,000 board feet per acre. That gave you some idea really of the contribution of another species that you see not in the direct, the one standing, but behind is the white pines. These trees are over 300 years old, maybe some of them approaching 400, but you don't see many of them anymore because the white pines are succeeding to hemlock and hardwoods. Monica?
And the reason they're succeeding is that they need sunlight to grow. And
The white pines.
The white pines do, the hemlocks do not. And so the forest has grown too much of a canopy to support new baby white pines.
Okay, moving on. Let's jump up into New York. Here is Pack Forest in the Adirondacks of New York. This is a natural area that you can visit near Orangeburg, New York. And I think the SUNY, State University of New York, has a research site there. And the one thing that always strikes me or captures my attention is that beyond this huge white pine, the spongy ground layer is covered in needles, it's covered in decaying matter, and this is another look of old growth. Monica?
And I'd just like to mention that the Adirondacks have the largest reserves of old growth in the East. They slightly surpass the Southern Appalachians, right? Or Appalachians,
Right.
whichever you say. And I want to emphasize that because I see in print figures like 75,000 acres of old growth for the Adirondacks or over 100,000 acres. That's of course true, but the true figure is
Over 300,000.
right. So
and it could be an entire presentation. We could do that on the evolution of our knowledge about what survived, what didn't, why some people thought most of the Adirondacks had been cut. Well, most of it had, but not anywhere near all of it, not 300,000 acres of it. Moving on.
this is like an Alfred Hitchcock movie. We have a cameo appearance of your main speaker, and his toys around his neck are, which he uses to measure trees, laser measuring devices, excuse me, And he's in his element with two large white pines and his measuring tools.
And Monica does refer to them lovingly as my toys, and they are. They all get names. I will not divulge
Don't
those
tell.
names here. But anyway, this is again in that same area, just a few yards away from the preceding slide. Let's move back down into Massachusetts and take a look at a very, very different old growth forest, one on a private property in Orange, Massachusetts. And this happens to be the location of the oldest tree that has been dated yet in Massachusetts, dated by my friend David Orwig, again at Harvard Forest. And I think I'm right that Dave got 537 years out of one of these trees, one of these black gums. It's not the one that you see there. However, they have been cored and dated to now over 700 years in neighboring New Hampshire. These trees survived because they didn't have economic value and they grew in a swamp or a bog.
Fine.
Now, what does this leave us with to talk about from the sequence of images that we had? How do we recognize old growth forests visually? Well, here are some major categories that we use. Monica will say a little bit more about the detail behind them, but you can see the upper left, trees, abundance of old large trees, late successional species like hemlocks, and standing dead snags such as white pines, lichen and fungal species associated with older trees. It goes on through the forest floor, what you see there, the forest structure, and disqualifying characteristics. But there's a lot more to it than that. Monica, what do we have for the group?
Okay, I think that there will be a link to our more, this is an expurgated version of Bob's list of old growth forest characteristics, and we have a more detailed one that there will be a link to in your chat with much better, more explanation about all of these elements. You've heard all of this so far in our presentation. Not the pits and mounds. It's a kind that means an undulating forest floor that you find in many old growth forests, not all. And we did not mention visible signs of human occupation because we had old growth forests to show you, and they don't have visible signs of human occupation.
At least that is the definition that most of us use. There's a lot of controversy, and there's a lot of different definitions out there. The U.S. Forest Service at one point cataloged over 100 definitions of old growth. But to my mind, if you leave a forest alone, people don't enter and change it visibly. Then after several centuries, it develops through its own processes, and what you get is an old growth forest. Moving on. Now, you can get an old growth forest that looks like those big trees in Pack Forest or Cook Forest, or you can get something that looks like this. Now, somebody said a warthog represented an animal species that could only be loved by its mother. The appearance of it isn't one to engender great affection. Some people might think this is the warthog of old growth because it is so cluttered. To my eyes, it's gorgeous. It represents thousands of niches that get filled. And how does it get so structurally complex? Well, it's on top of a mountain with very thin soils, cold temperatures, lots of wind. And over time, this is what you get. You stay on the trail in a place like this. You don't try to wander off. Monica?
Yeah, one old growth forest characteristic that you can define for many forests is that you can't walk through them, for sure. I love this forest because it's endured, and you almost can see and feel what it has endured. And I was asking Bob what he liked about this forest, and you came up with a great word. Do you remember?
No, I forgot.
That it's wild.
Wild. Oh, yes.
Wild.
Yeah, it's a wild forest. Well, let's see. Let's move on. Now, here is one of our all-time favorite places in forests in Massachusetts, a place that exists where you wouldn't expect it, right in the town of Stockbridge, Massachusetts. It's also part of a very important organization that preserves old growth forests for educational purpose, the Old Growth Forest Network. I'm a part of that. I'm a county coordinator. But looking at this site has a lot of history behind it. I can talk on for hours. I'm going to let Monica speak.
Well, let me add one thing. There will be a link in your chat to the Old Growth Forest Network. It was founded by our friend Joan Maloof, and currently the president is Sarah Adlu. But just you can learn more about that wonderful organization. Now, here we are in Ice Glen. It's a ravine. All these boulders have kind of fallen down, and there are these mysterious dark places that you can find. And it's called Ice Glen because these places stay cold. Even in June, people would harvest ice from the crevasses of Ice Glen. It's Mohegan land, originally, homeland. They still have a relationship with the town of Stockbridge and do archaeological research there. And these are two oaks, and this is, how old is this hemlock?
I don't know,
Sweetie,
but I
you
would
don't know?
250 to 300.
Okay, there.
And you can see here also, get my pointer over, like having trouble with it. There it is. This is the boulder field. It's post-glacial, but it's just a jumble of rocks. And on top of these rocks, polypody fern grows in profusion, and the colonies of that fern have developed literally over centuries. So it again is a place of niches, but the trees themselves are large and old, and it has a lot of Ice Glen has a lot of historical significance. It inspired in part by Herman Melville in his epic
Moby
Dick book, The Icy Glen. He walked there.
So this is the last of our old growth forest pictures that we're going to show you, and we're going to move on to our next topic, which is carbon sequestration and storage, and answer some of the questions that come up around carbon sequestration
in trees. Now, here we go. First point, big trees equal lots of carbon. That you would think would be obvious. I think it is obvious to most people, because if you take all of the wood in the bark of a big tree and you dry it out, you drive away all the water, then what's left is dry biomass, and that's approximately 50% carbon. So the bigger the tree, the more the carbon. Now and then we make discoveries in 2020, 22, 23, 24, nobody would have thought of. This is the largest white pine, single trunk white pine we know of, discovered by Eric Danielson of Harvard Forest down to the right. And I could talk an hour about this tree. What I want to point out, though, is that over its life, it has probably sequestered at least 38 tons of carbon dioxide. That means it has removed from the atmosphere that amount of carbon dioxide. That's called sequestration. How fast that happened, over what period of time it was really growing fast, etc. That's a lot of what the controversy about this is about. Monica, anything?
Just to add, to note, even at its age of 250 years, it is still sequestering 65 pounds of carbon a year.
Dioxide per year.
Carbon dioxide, sorry.
And,
okay.
And that, by the way, is my calculation. It may be more than that, because what I'm basically assuming is that this tree is growing extremely slowly. That might not be true. However, a tree that I do know intimately in the Mohawk Trail State Forest is Tecumseh, named after the Shawnee chief. This is in the Elders Grove, with a stand of huge white pines in Mark Trail State Forest. This tree that you see has been climbed multiple times. You can see a climbing rope right here. And our purpose was to climb and model this tree meter by meter going up, so that we could know very accurately how much total volume was in the trunk and into the limbs. In 2008, it was climbed. You can see the height and the circumference at breast height at that point. We, in 2021, took these measurements. Those measurements, by the way, were from Jared Lockwood. And as a consequence, we can figure out in between that per year, this pine absorbed about 320 pounds of carbon dioxide per year. Now, the tree is over 150 years old, but probably not by much. But I wanted to point that out, the 320 as opposed to the assumed 65 on the preceding slide. This tree is still cranking away. Monica?
Fine.
Okay, going from a single tree, where might we see the greatest biomass of any forest that we know of in Massachusetts? When I mean that on an acre basis, the William Cullen Bryant Homestead Rivulet or Pine Loop Forest in Cummington, Mass. And there's a lot, folks. You can see the numbers on the right. I have calculated that I think there's about 145 tons of carbon stored per acre in several acres. It's not a huge area that has that much in it, but at least where you're looking at that's above and below ground. And if we convert all that to carbon dioxide stored, you have about 2 million pounds that have been pulled out per acre of the atmosphere to deposit that much carbon, the 145 tons, in the trees above and below ground. To match that, you would have to drive about between 180 and 190 cars, about 11,000 miles a year. Quite a lot.
Okay. In your chat, there will be a link to the trustees if you would like to look up more about this. This forest is owned by the trustees of reservations, used to be Massachusetts.
Right. Okay, moving on. Now comes the part that appeals to my engineering roots, my background. Clearing up misinformation on carbon sequestration. The big debate is, do younger trees sequester more carbon than older trees? Point. Young trees do grow fast, that is obvious, but it takes time for them to acquire a sufficient number of leaves, a large enough crown, in other words, that through photosynthesis, they can actually store a significant amount of carbon in their trunks and branches, roots and whatnot per year. By contrast, an older tree, and I'm not talking about one that's, dying, but otherwise healthy older tree has a much larger crown and stores more carbon dioxide annually. And we wanted to show you this more graphically. And looking at the left graph, that is of a large northern red oak. And what we've done is we've identified carbon dioxide captured out of the atmosphere in 10-year increments, starting from 0 and going all the way to 200. Now, you can see that it happens pretty quickly, that it builds up in 10-year increments to a lot. But the most carbon that is being pulled, carbon dioxide, that's being pulled out of the atmosphere is between 70, and I'm talking about for this tree, 70 and 140 years. Then it slows down considerably. Okay, looking at the right graph, in the first 70 years, the oaks pulled out about 14,000 pounds of CO2 from the air. In the next 70 years, it's pulled out 28,200 pounds. It has about 5,200 or so pounds remaining to go. or 5,020 or whatever that adds up to. At any rate, you can see where the majority of the growth and the sequestration is happening. And it's no accident. That's where the tree has a big crown, and that's before it starts losing ground through internal decay.
However, it's accumulating carbon, though at a slower rate. And so by 200, it has acquired 47,000 pounds.
Okay, now that point, keep in mind that point, please, because look at this. If you go to the internet, courtesy of Google searching, and you say, how much does a carbon dioxide does a mature tree sequester in a year, you will be flooded with sources that say 48 pounds of carbon dioxide sequestered per year. That is ridiculous. That is totally wrong. That is a product of searches of repeating over and over the same result. Trees in good health sequester a lot more carbon annually when they get to a sufficient size. If you go to the US government, Department of Energy Information Administration, a 13-year-old medium growing planted northern red oak sequesters about 49 pounds per year, and that's about equivalent to the 48 pounds that we show there. But by the time it's 60 years old, that number is up to 305 pounds, and that's medium growing. If that were a fast growing oak, it would be 553 pounds. Now, think of that. If we go all the way over to the West Coast and we take a large redwood, and there are many of them that would fit into this category, they can sequester a metric ton of carbon dioxide in a year. Well, that's a redwood, yes, but our trees, 300, several hundreds of pounds. Why on earth are organizations that ought to know better have standing, in other words, quoting this 48-pound figure?
Okay. One of the reasons why we are making a big deal about this is that the 48 is so much all over the place. And it's quoted by the Arbor Day Foundation, by American Forests, by a number of very respectable universities. It even is quoted by part of the Forest Service, which is the source of all of the good information we have. But somebody who was doing publicity found that on the internet and put it out. Now, why is it important to know that this is wrong? Because there was a professor at MIT that wrote an essay about this and said, what's this deal about 48 pounds? That's not very much. Why are we bothering to save trees? And he's right. If that is the right answer, we shouldn't be bothering saving trees. So my advice to all of you is, when you see that 48 pounds figure, kill it.
That says it pretty well. Moving on. Now, how much carbon does a big oak store compared to a younger tree? First of all, we want to show you a picture of the big oak. Now let's go forward. And here is a diagram that we created for our good friend Martin Tusser over in the Czech Republic, who is saving big street trees. And the question was, well, don't young trees grow fast enough? If you got a big mature tree, cut it down and plant a lot of little ones, and overnight they'll sequester as much carbon as the big tree was sequestering. Ain't true. Wrong. It takes a lot of seedlings to make up for that one big tree. Eventually, they grow into the size where the number starts to become manageable, but it takes a lot of area and it takes a lot of time. So we thought that we would show you in a graphic what the trade-off is. Now, who would want to cut that big tree? Well, developers. They have a reason to develop for apartments, for whatever. And if they can say, don't worry about the big tree, we're going to plant some young trees and they'll sequester as much carbon as the big tree is going to have. Wrong. Well, that's our what did you call that, Tammy? What was the, Monica, you call that diagram, the rock star
diagram of Yeah, this has been all over Europe, and anyway, it's one of our favorite charts for our talks.
Okay.
And
moving
now
on.
for our last slide.
Okay, Monica, I turn it over to you on that one. You can.
Well,
say-
this is an old growth yellow birch in Mohawk that we
No, Monroe.
Monroe, sorry, I meant Monroe State Forest. We took Mitch Epstein to it, and he took this fabulous picture of it. And it's a picture that we feel evokes a lot of what we sense about old growth. And therefore, we have a copy of it in our bedroom, and we go to sleep at night and wake up in the morning seeing it. So that's it. Enjoy.
Well,
And we're open.
well-
Actually, we're now finished and open for questions.
well,
right?
folks, I would add to what Monica just said is that you can say, all right, we have this picture in our bedroom, and we get our kicks by looking at the tree as opposed to whatever else you might come to mind. Well, we're 80 and 83. I think, Andy, I better turn it over back to you at this point.
Yeah, good timing, Bob. I'll jump right in. First of all, thank you so much. You guys continue to inspire me, to motivate and inform our work at the Conservancy and across the whole conservation community. So thank you guys for that great presentation. I do want to, we're getting some great questions, so I want to pivot to those. And as a reminder to our audience, please continue to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But I'm going to jump right in, so no rest for the weary. Where can we see old growth in Massachusetts, Monica and Bob?
I'm going to turn this over to Monica because she's heard me say this over and over, and she can say it better. Monica?
Well, I'm going to give just a short list. Now, many of the forests you see that I'm going to mention right now are in our show. Were in our show. William Cullen Bryant Homestead Rivulet Forest. You did not see old growth in our pictures, but it does have a genuine small old growth section. Mohawk Trail State Forest in Charlemont and Savoy Mountain State Forest in Savoy. Those two are adjoining. Monroe State Forest in Monroe, Ice Glen in Stockbridge, Mount Greylock State Reservation, another forest that only a mother could love, but there it is. No, that's not Mount Greylock is beautiful. Yeah. It's Wachusett Mountain that is the forest that only a mother could love. Gilder Pond, Mount Everett State Reservation in Washington, and Bash Bish Falls in Mount Washington. You'll never remember all of that. And so we are going to prepare that list with much more detail about websites and directions and things like that. And that will be in the communication you get a week after this webinar with handouts from us and whatever, and that will be one of the handouts.
Great, thank you. I'm going to keep coming at you with some questions because we've got some good ones. Can you speak to the resiliency of old growth when faced with pests like hemlock, woolly adelgid, and emerald ash borer? Bob, the resiliency of old growth. And we had another related question: what's the health of the old growth hemlocks?
Well, this is an excellent question because, quite frankly, old growth forests too can become overwhelmed by alien species and diseases brought in from afar. So in some cases, if we want an area to survive with the species that are there now, we have to intercede. And therefore we have treatments for the hemlock woolly adelgid, the emerald ash borer, the Asian longhorn beetle, and other tree diseases. We're in new times with climate change and with the number of alien species coming in. Over time, a large old growth area can absorb some of this, but not all of it. I'm not sure did that answer the question?
Yeah, that's good, Bob. That's great. Here's a question, a quick, simple one that Alice writes in. I thought red pines were short-lived, and you were showing old growth red pine. So how do you reconcile that?
No, they're not short-lived.
Okay.
Oftentimes, a perception of a tree as being long-lived or short-lived have to do with how we have cultivated it. Let's say for the purpose of ringing reservoirs with red pine, and then they get a disease root disease. And since it's a kind of a plantation, if one dies, they all die. But if you go up into places like Minnesota and whatnot, you can find 300 to 400-year-old red pines all over the place.
And I want to mention my favorite red pine site is Itasca State Park in Minnesota. People go there because they can see the source of the Mississippi River, which is wonderful. But those red pines, you don't even know what a red pine can be unless you've gone to Itasca State.
That's great.
Park.
Wow. Yeah, it's cool. And a lot of them are plantation trees in Massachusetts, but there are some native stands like you showed.
Yes.
So Susan writes in, asks, she grew up near Mohawk Trail State Forest and loves seeing the pictures. She remembers the forest is quite thick and beautiful. Why do you consider it the mecca of eastern old growth?
Well, several reasons. It's got the largest acreage of old growth. It also has in the state among the oldest trees that we've dated are there. It's in a highly scenic area, so it combines a lot of pluses. Part of that forest is not old growth, but it's very mature. And the tallest trees in New England grow in Mohawk Trail State Forest. We have measured them 10 ways to Sunday. We've even climbed them. We've tape dropped them. The Jake Swamp white pine, for example, at its best, it was 176.2 feet tall. And although it isn't officially old growth, it's mature. There's just so many charms there.
You certainly do talk about it more than any other from my experience with you. That's great. Is the term old growth, Wendell writes in, to equivalent to the term climax forest?
Well, originally climax was a term developed by forestry people, silviculturists and whatnot, that studied and assumed that a forest developed, let's say, from a field and went through a series of stages called succession, and finally reached a kind of a balance where new growth and existing growth and decay are balanced, and it stays pretty much the same. That's got a little bit of authenticity to it, particularly in the central latitudes and Atlantic states, but these forests are much more dynamic than that. So climax is kind of out of vogue these days.
Great. Yep. And there's a question about what tree species are those at the Cullen Bryant site?
Well, what we showed were white pines, but the oldest trees in there are hemlocks. We could have shown many slides showing beautiful old hemlocks, beautiful old yellow birches, a number of species. But the ones that were in that slide were white pines on the pine loop.
Great. Thanks, Bob. You guys okay? I'm peppering you to get as many in before we have to wrap up.
Let them fly. Let them fly.
Okay. Here's a question from Sharon. Is the trend of CO2 sequestration similar to many of our native trees, or just peculiar to the red oak that you showed?
Oh no, it's peculiar. Each species has a different growth history. And some species like white pine grow very fast. They've got enough resin in the wood to preserve them, so they'll hold on to their carbon, but they're adding carbon quite rapidly. Other species like cottonwoods, the poplars, grow very rapidly and they die pretty quickly, so they gain carbon dioxide quickly, but they also lose it. Others like the hickories and whatnot are very dense and they grow slowly. Every species has its own growth curve and whatnot, but a lot of them will be comparable in our forest to red oak, somewhat comparable. Maples won't be appreciably different, for example. Sugar maple, red maple, a good deal different.
Great. Here's a change of pace from Jacques. Excellent presentation. Thank you to both of you. Are there any examples that come to mind of art or other creative expression being used to preserve and or honor our old growth forests. These spaces are so inspiring and beautiful, even the warthogs of the bunch.
Michelle's the art.
Well, yeah, we've already mentioned our art photographer friend, Mitch Epstein, and he's absolutely wonderful. And he's having a show in the fall in New York. You can go to his website and see all of that. We do have a new friend, Michelle
Luigi.
Luigi, who has been working with our friend Bill Mumont on some art projects. She does work with plastic. She's recycling plastic into artworks. I think but I don't.
There are people who, in fact, see great artistic value in these old forests and depict it in a number of ways. I wish we had done a little more reviewing and putting some more stuff in the chat or whatnot about that. But it's always a tremendous opportunity to tie the two.
Great, Bob and Monica. Here's one more technical question. Have you encountered any definitive formula for below ground carbon storage on a per acre or per tree basis?
Well, I use what comes out of the U.S. Forest Service. My good friend Tony D'Amato, courtesy of him and Paul Catanzaro, they came out with a forest carbon paper out of UMass and University of Vermont. And in it, they quote 2018 statistics out of the U.S. Forest Service for carbon pools and what would be underground, what would be above ground, what would be in different pools for a forest that's between 80 and 100 years old. I don't have anything outside of what exists through the Forest Service, and I'm certainly happy to share those.
Great. Thank you, Bob. And maybe we can get a few more answers and put those into our response to all the participants, because we didn't get to every question today. But we're about to wrap up, so I wanted to ask you, Monica and Bob, if you had any final thoughts you'd like to share before we do.
You don't want to ask me that question because I go on forever. So I'm going to turn around and say, Monica, help.
Well, remember to kill the 48 pounds of carbon stored by a average mature tree. And the other is a slogan that we learned from Andrea Kaluori, who used to manage the Bryant Homestead for the trustees. And she made t-shirts that said, "May the old growth forest be with you." And that's our final.
Excellent. Wonderful closing. Thank you both for coming today. It's great. Bob, I'm in a meeting with you tomorrow, so I'm lucky to see you again. But I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you for all your support, your generous support of the Nature Conservancy. We'll be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with a link to a recording of this webinar. And if you're enjoying our webinars, please be sure to share them with your friends and colleagues. You can follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and to get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with us. This is the last of our spring webinars, a great crescendo here, but stay tuned for additional programming through our web channels. Thanks, Bob and Monica, and thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.